Hello, and welcome to another wrap up. Let's talk about what I read and watched in the month of September. For reading, this was a pretty odd month because I read a lot very early in the month. And then towards the end of the month, I really slowed down, and I still haven't finished any books yet this month in October. And I think some of that is just a regression to the mean. The pace that I was reading at the beginning of the month was not ever going to be sustainable. But also, I think my post work brain has been particularly bad lately. Very buzzy brain, unable to focus. And hopefully that goes away soon. But all of that is to say, a lot of these books feel very far away from me at this point. Like I read them just in a totally different era, which is kind of weird. So let's see how much I have to say about these books now. The first book I finished was The Raven Boys, the graphic novel. This is a series that I totally loved when I read it in 2015, but I haven't reread this series since then, so my memory of it is a lot more vibes than anything specific in the plot. What I remember loving about this series was the very strong friendship dynamics and this witchy, mythical, magical environment that casts everything with a beautiful, bizarre atmosphere. The main character is a teenage girl named Blue, and she is raised by a family of witches in Virginia, and she has this curse. She has to live with the knowledge that if she ever kisses her true love, he will die. I think those are some really fun YA stakes, and they set up a lot of yearning. And if I'm being honest, I think a big part of the appeal to my younger asexual self might have been the fact that romance is sidestepped a lot because of that plot barrier. But in any case, Blue runs in with this group of teenage boys from a local private school, and they embark on a quest to find an ancient Welsh king, Glendower, who they believe was brought to Virginia after his death. And that belief is based on the fact that there are ley lines that are hotspots of magical energy, and this town that they live in Virginia is loaded with this mystical magical energy. So bringing it back to the graphic novel, I did think that the graphic novel perfectly conveyed the atmosphere that I remembered from these books. In terms of the art, the color palettes that were chosen and the use of lighting, I thought was really gorgeous, and it was really effective for creating that atmosphere as we move between Blue's witchy house and these other urban settings and then these mystical forest settings. But in terms of the writing, obviously you have fewer words to work with in a graphic novel. And I do think that they've really got the core story beats and the core moments, but I also think that a reader who is brand new to the story, I could see them feeling a bit lost, especially when it comes to the motivations of the characters. But it's hard to say, it's hard to say what someone else would or wouldn't be confused by, because if you don't know what you're missing, then you don't know what you're missing and you wouldn't necessarily be confused by it. In any case, this is a pretty long-winded way of saying that I thought it was a solid adaptation, but I would point a new reader to the original books. And I'm kind of curious to do a reread of this series, but I'm also kind of scared to do a reread of this series because what if I hate it now? I really loved it when I first read it. The next book I finished was The Buffalo Hunter, and this one is a contender for one of my favorite books of the year. This is a historical vampire book. It's set primarily in Montana in the early 20th century, but it does have a framing story set in the modern day. So the initial setup is that we have a struggling academic named Etsy Bocarn, who is notified when her great-great-grandfather's diary is found at a construction site. So she gets her hands on this diary and she sets out to read it with the intention of developing it into a book or a project that will help her gain tenure at her job. Arthur Bocarn Her ancestor was a Lutheran priest, and his diary contains both his own meditations as well as a transcript of a confession of sorts that was given to him by a man from the Blackfeet Nation over the course of several weeks. So, going in, you can expect this to be a book about revenge. You can expect this to be a book about the effects of American westward expansion on Native American people and culture. And I guess for context, this is my first Stephen Graham Jones book, and I think what really impressed me about his writing was the way that he really expanded on those themes very deeply by creating these parallels, this foil relationship between Arthur and between Goodstab, the Blackfoot man, because this is a story about revenge, but it is also a story about reinvention and regret. And something that I think the vampire genre and gothic horror is really concerned with is the intrusion of the past upon the present. And that's something that's happening in this book with multiple characters, several layers deep. I have heard some people say that this book has a slow start. I didn't really feel that. I was pretty wrapped up in the suspense of it from the very beginning. But I do think I understand. I have some mixed feelings about Etsy's sections, and her sections kick off the novel and close the novel, because these are set in a modern time period and it's pretty tonally different from the bulk of the book that is set further in the past. But I do think Etsy's sections add this important element of continued projection of this horrible past into the present. The next book I read was Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green. I listened to this book. It is less than 6 hours on audio, and I thought this was a great, short, accessible overview of the history of tuberculosis and the current state of global healthcare inequities. Structurally, it alternates between more factual, historical overview of TB in a scientific and cultural understanding, and the personal story of John Green's friend, Henry Ryder, who is a young man that he met in Sierra Leone who was battling drug-resistant tuberculosis. This book is really short, but I think it brings enough depth to accomplish its main goals, which is to bring more awareness to global healthcare inequities and also to bring awareness to the way that illness shapes our culture and the way our cultures shape the treatment of illness in terms of a cure, but also in terms of the way that the ill are treated socially and the amount of empathy that we have for them. I don't think it needed to be longer because it did what it intended to do. And he does link you to other resources for further reading if you want them. But I did think that, like, for its length, it was perfect. The next book I read was Endling by Maria Reva. This was my choice of read off of the Booker Prize long list, and I am pleased about that. I enjoyed it greatly. I ended up talking about it in a separate review video a few weeks ago, so I'll keep this shorter. But this is a really wonderful, darkly funny, absurd take on the marriage industry in Ukraine, on the value of art and activism, and on the experience of the Ukrainian diaspora in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The next book I read was The Long Walk by Stephen King in preparation for watching the movie. And basically, I think this is my least favorite book of the year so far. I gave it 2 stars because I did finish it and because I can appreciate that it was written in a different time when death contests were a less explored concept in our general culture. But I really thought it was incredibly boring to read. I thought it was underdeveloped. I thought it was misogynistic. There was just something about this one where I did not care who lived and who died, and I did not care about the ideas being explored around morality or masculinity or coming of age. That's just how it was. The next book I read was The Morningside by Taya Obrecht. This is another one where I was primarily bored while I was reading it, but the ideas inside of it were much more interesting. And I think my experience of this book suffered because I was feeling sour and impatient after my reading of The Long Walk, where I was also feeling sour and impatient. So this book takes place in an unspecified near future city that is slowly being consumed by a rising tide, and the residents are leaving that city. But our main character is an 11-year-old girl who has just moved into the city with her mother. And they are immigrants who were displaced by a war in their native land, and they are being sponsored here as part of a repopulation program to combat the urban abandonment in the city. This book was really slow and kind of meandering, but by the time I got to the end, I thought the themes that it explored around belonging to a place and to memory and the way the world changes based on our individual and collective actions. I thought all of those themes were really fascinating and fit together very nicely. The next book I finished was Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is an interesting one to think about in parallel with The Buffalo Hunter because this is another historical horror book that is reckoning with the intrusion of colonial past upon the present. But this is more in the tradition of a classic Gothic novel. This is set in Mexico in the 1950s, and the main character is a young woman named Noemi, and she is tasked with rescuing her cousin Catalina, who has married into this aristocratic English family and has sent a strange letter back home that indicates that she's unwell, and her family is like, what's going on? We should send someone to figure out if she needs help. I think Moreno Garcia was attempting something quite interesting by bringing a very classic Gothic mansion setting and story into Mexico and using the house as this representation of colonialism and white supremacy. I also thought there was an interesting angle about gender roles here. Noemi is a very stylish and attractive but independent woman, and bringing her into this traditional setting brought some really interesting friction. But otherwise, I felt the novel was a bit bland. There was very little character development, and the plot itself, I did not find it to be very shocking. And the audiobook narrator did not work for me on this one, for the record. I ended up switching to reading the ebook version because I thought the narrator's like Englishy accents were very distracting, and I didn't really like her speaking cadence. And then finally, I read There Is No Place for Us, Working in Homeless in America by Max Gladstone. This is a nonfiction about a type of homelessness which is underrepresented in national statistics and cultural consciousness. Like everything is tuberculosis, this one combines factual reporting with personal stories. But I would say that this book leans more towards the personal narrative side of things. It follows 5 families living in Atlanta who all join the ranks of the working homeless. So they are ending up in their cars or in extended stay hotels because they are unable to find apartments that they can afford, and they are unable to find or qualify for housing assistance. So this is a book about failing systems and failing policies, and I think it does a great job at shining a light on the reality of that deserves more public attention. However, I do wish there had been more overarching reporting, more of a voice from our author. It doesn't end in a very hopeful way, and I don't think that we're in a very hopeful place in America with regards to this topic, but I do wish there had been a little bit more of a call to action. These stories were so centered on Atlanta, Georgia, that it did have me wondering how similar or different the problem is in other cities. So it does illuminate very well the urgent need for solutions that address the root cause of homelessness in terms of the rising cost of housing, in terms of gentrification, and the limitations and lack of resources for implementing social welfare programs. But I think I just wanted a wider frame of reference with which to understand like how local these problems were as they were presented in the book. So those are my reads. I also watched a couple of movies. I already mentioned that I read The Long Walk in preparation to watch The Long Walk movie. This movie was directed by Francis Lawrence, who has also notably done the Hunger Games movies. So I thought that was interesting. In general, I have an aversion to the premise of The Long Walk, but I thought this was much more interesting to watch than it was to read. I think part of that is that the movie is simply shorter. I think if the book had been a short story, I would have enjoyed it more. I also thought the performances were really well done in the movie. This is a movie that is just walking and talking, and so the performances really need to carry the film, and I thought they did a great job. And then, without spoiling anything, I thought the ending of the movie was far more interesting and thought provoking than the ending of the book. So they did a nice job with that one. The only other movie I watched this month was The Roses, starring Benedict Cumberbatch and Olivia Colman. This movie is based on a 1981 novel that I have not read called The War of the Roses. And that book had a previous adaptation directed by Danny DeVito in 1989. I also haven't watched that. What I know is that in all versions of this story, it is a Black comedy about a divorce. Not being familiar with the source material, I thought this adaptation was pretty fun. I've heard that it is a little lighter or gentler in its conflict than the source material potentially, which I do find intriguing because when it gets toxic, it does get pretty toxic. So I'm curious what differs in the other versions of this story. I did not enjoy the scenes with Andy Samberg and Kate McKinnon, who were acting as friends of the main couple. I feel like they were just from an entirely different, more vulgar movie instead of the sharp, witty back and forth that was happening between Cumberbatch's and Coleman's characters. So I don't really know what that was about, but overall I thought it was witty and entertaining, and I'm mildly interested in getting a better understanding of where it diverges from the source material. Last month I mentioned this was coming, but the first episode of Critical Role Campaign 4 aired last Thursday, and it was about as wonderful as I could have hoped it would be. This is a D&D campaign that is being DM'd by Brennan Lee Mulligan, and I probably won't continue talking about this show forever and ever, but it has brought me back into the Critical Role fold, and I want to rave about it in case I can catch anyone else who wants to jump in before they get too far into this campaign that it feels too intimidating. So this is a campaign that takes place in a world where mortals rebelled and killed the gods about 70 years prior to this taking place. My sense is that Brennan's going to be using that setting to explore how people think about religion and the afterlife in the aftermath of the gods dying, and also looking into where political and magical power is created in the void that has been left by the gods. There are 13 player characters in this campaign, which is insane, but my understanding is that they're going to eventually separate into 3 different play groups that are playing at separate tables. But for the first episode, everyone in the cast was present, and they were just rotating characters in and out as they needed and introducing them one by one. And I thought that the way that they did that was really quite smooth and effective and made things feel more cinematic. So I'm really looking forward to that more, and it's fun to get back into a community where there's a slow, steady drip of content that people are actively discussing and theorizing about. That's it for September. I'm hoping I can get the ball rolling again with my reading in October. I'm planning to read some spooky stuff in addition to some National Book Award books. I'm playing with the idea of creating more of a reading vlog style video around one of the projects I'm doing, so we'll see if I actually have the time to film and edit that the way that I want to. But do please share in the comments how your reading has been going lately and what you're looking forward to next month. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.